So it's live, okay, that's cool, awesome. Yeah, hello, thanks for having me. First of all, I hope you're as excited as I'm. Like, today's really awesome so far. I enjoyed all the speaker talks so far, so that's really cool. And yeah, I have the pleasure to talk to you about data-driven user interface engineering today. And I'll try to emphasize a little bit on Vue.js itself. Who am I? My name's Rowan. You can reach me on Twitter at CodeBrio or at CodeShip is the company I'm working at. And generally, you maybe ask, OK, what's this in general about this talk? Like data-driven user interface engineering sounds very generic, like a term thrown around, and it partially is, but that's cool. So generally, I want to put some emphasis on the difference between DOM-driven user interfaces and data-driven. So let's start by looking a little bit into DOM-driven user interfaces. How can you say, OK, that your JavaScript or the application you're coding is very DOM-driven from what you're doing? And I say that the easiest thing to realize it is by if a node is heavily involved in what you're doing, and in this case, I mean a DOM node or something like this. And as an example, looking a little bit like jQuery. So if you define a class, ID, or whatever, if your entry point to the interactions of the application is a node, then it's a good indicator for being DOM-driven. Oops. And very often in this approach, so the DOM is actually the thing that tells you the way where your application is going and dictating how it should look like. And a very simple code example here is you do interactions, and I did it a few months ago, still this way or so, where it's like my item, if it has a class, then I want to do a certain interaction, like change something or do this. Or, for example, I use data attributes to get certain interactivity entry points at one point. So this all is a very good indicator that your JavaScript is heavily depending on the DOM. And yeah, don't be too talk around. I want to have some code examples that kind of brings this home. And I would say a good indicator is this is a super simple application. Yeah, let's say all we want to do is we have an application that should greet you at some point. So we have an input field where you put in your name, and it should print out the name on the site itself. And then you want to show an alert box or something like this. For example, the JavaScript behind this could look something like this, where we say we reference all the nodes we have on our page. Like we do it even a smart way that we don't have a lot of selectors in there. We try to put those nodes into variables up for, where we say the input, the button, the target. We have all this kind of built up. And then we bind our basic interactions. So we say, like, on key press, I want to show, for example, the value up in the target field that I have defined. Or on the button, when I click on it, I should pop up an alert showing me the value of the input field. That seems pretty straightforward. And it felt exactly the same way for me. Like it was, this is how you should do it, or how you do it, or build it up for. And it also makes a lot of sense when you look at it next to each other. Like you say, OK, I don't have a lot of JavaScript cluttering my view. Like also the HTML is currently staying out of my JavaScript. So I have very good, I would say, separation, separation, yeah, whatever. And here, it makes a lot of sense to see them next to each other, so you know which point gets in which area. But before we get into the obvious points that could break what we're doing here, let's just look at this piece of HTML code again on its own. Does anybody know, without knowing the JavaScript behind it, what this page should do, which kind of behavior comes from? It's like super hard to tell. You have actually no clue. And where is what event going to happen? And the same is if you look at the JavaScript itself. Like you know, OK, there's a certain reference to DOM nodes you have on the page, but you have no clue how your page itself looks like. So both independently, they don't make a lot of sense. And here, if we go forward with our application, and at one point, we develop our application. It gets better and better over time. And at this point, we have a more sophisticated approach already. So we decided to split up name on first name and last name. And also, we have like an extra input field. And we have a button that would maybe reset our form at one point. and we're already kind of like in deep shit already, because for some reason, 90% of our JavaScript code we wrote before is now completely useless. We can't use it. It's like, yeah, we can't do anything with it. We click on the page, we type somewhere, nothing is happening. And the interesting thing is, it's not that the page itself changed completely. It's if you look at this, it started at this one point where we say we changed the first input reference to name. That's where our whole JavaScript itself broke. And all the rest, even if it's completely functional, like it will never do anything for you. Completely lost track of what's going on. Because your main input bound was to the name field. In this case, and now it's called first name, so yeah. And now everything else on the page will not fire at all. It's kind of sad. And to look a little bit more pragmatic about it, so what's going on, I try to bring it down into two parts. I would say, like, there's always, from the application point, there's always the input part, where say, okay, you want to alter data, you want to change data, and then there's always the output part where you want to show certain data pieces. And if we look here, in this case, our data that we actually want to use for our application, it's inside the input field. And we, from the outside, our JavaScript, how we set it up, is we watch exactly at this input field, and then we say, okay, like we dictate our behavior, change everything based on that input field, whatever happens there. And if we say, like in our example before, we watch on input changes, what we actually do is we copy that data to our output section. What would be the span, for example, printing out the name. So we have actually 2 times the same data on the same page, and it's a copy. It's not so cool. And as we see before, as soon as we change one piece of information, like the tag in this case, our whole thing is kind of broken. And at this point, I really hope it's not only familiar to me, because like that's what I experienced a lot of time, and that makes development cycles very long and tedious, and you do something, code a prototype, and then you have to update everything, and something breaks, and you have to hunt down the little bug. So yeah, it's hopefully not only me. And it's time for a dramatic drinking pause. And at this point, for me, I think it was about 3 years ago, Angular was for me the rescue to say, okay, yeah, there's must be better ways to deal with this. And like I think everybody knows or kind of heard of Angular at this point. And I just want to look a little bit into it. This is how a typical Angular page at this point looked like. Where say you have your ng controller, you have kind of bindings of what's happening inside your page on this page itself. And that felt like, okay, that's like super, super cool, because now my page itself is a very good indicator for how my code behaves below it. And even if I don't see the JavaScript, I know kind of what's going on at the page. So see, I have a click on this page, and it should call a function that's called greet for some reason. I have bound something up called like the ng model. What does something? And for some reason, I have those mustache tags that print out a name. So I have a very good hunch for what's going on and how the page behaves without knowing how the script below looks. And at this point, I don't want to go too much into Angular itself, so let's move on here a little bit. And by doing this, by building this slide, there was one thing that always bugs me, and that's the emoji. Like you say, moving on, and the international direction of moving forward is always going to the right. But for some reason, this is kind of like running, or to the left, sorry, and this one is going to the right. What feels kind of always like running away from something. That's more the philosophical question I always have when building slides. But yeah, that has nothing to do with it. It's just like a small excursus. So the next thing is, okay, how can we actually build our interface data-driven? What's kind of the better approach here? Where can we put the DOM nodes itself out of the equation? Because even if Angular looks kind of it, does there have some data behind it? When you know we work with it or so, there's a lot of references happening to the node, and actually it's all still very reliant on the DOM itself, how everything goes on there. And to go back to our graphic, our advanced graphic we had before, where we have our input and output area, in this case, where would you put the data? yeah, like can't decide, should it be in the input box? Should it be in the output box? Where's our data? And in this case, like on a data-driven approach, of course, I don't want to say where should my data exactly be. I only know it should be outside of the input or the output or whatever, because I want to have it should be on its own, consistable, and should be working and living on its own. And I could reuse it whatever I like, for example. And if I build a data-driven approach, so how would I behave like going similar direction like to the application we saw before? The watcher would probably in this case be not on the outside. We don't build it from the outside, but we set our watcher, in this case, bound to the input. So here we say, OK, like you're the piece that watches the data from the outside. You're not the one that hosts the data, but you know what's going on there. And eventually, like if it's an input or so, you can set it up in a way that say, like it's always getting like synced as well. Like if you have your input bound to the input field, like we had before, the data, if you change the input, of course, that you want your data to change. So you would need to set it up in a way that this piece kind of just alters the data outside, but has never kind of like is the solely point of knowing the data itself. And it's the same for the output. And in this case, for the output, all you do is kind of you really watch the data that you have and say, OK, like I'm here, I'm your mustache tag, and if something happens or so, I will present whatever piece of information I know what I get. And without going into like a certain library or framework yet, like just how would you approach this kind of thing? That's okay, like I want to have something that's kind of sophisticated, standing on its own. And this is for me one of the things that I actually came up with quite early. Where I say, okay, maybe all I want and need in JavaScript is just a JSON hash that has information. Like in this case, our hash can have functions, can have arrays, can whatever kind of information we want and we need can be inside one of a hash. So as kind of a clean approach to have some kind of separation, I created a data key where I say, OK, inside this data, I have all actually the data that I want to use on my page. And here I said, OK, my name, in this case, I have John Doe there. And then also defined, OK, I want to have certain methods on my page. And they should be kind of related to the data, but they should not be referencing anything on the page itself. It should be self-reliant. So I say, OK, I have my methods key, and inside there I have a function called greet. And if you're kind of wondering, that's really just ES6 syntax, or ES7. It's like the short tag for greet, function stuff or so. You just write it like this. And here I say, OK, like I have an alert here. And as you also maybe remember the jQuery piece we had before, where you say, OK, like we reference the DOM node again, get this value, and take this one for the greeting message. In this case, all we do is we reference our JSON hash that we actually have already. We say, OK, here in the data piece, we have our name already. So that's the one that I want to show. I don't need to know anything about the outside. And to kind of still have this kind of connection, and that was one thing that I really liked about Angular at this point, was that you can have a hunch of what the application is doing without seeing the JavaScript. So on a very simple approach, I think I tried to copy a similar thing, where I say, OK, like I have the name and the mustache tags, because that's like something currently I think everybody uses mustache tags in every JavaScript library, language, whatever. And I like the way of calling it model, and it's like very familiar to everybody. So in this case, on my input field, I would say something like model, and you should point to the name. And also, I want to see that something should trigger an action. So I have a click event in this case and say, OK, you should greet. And that's like just really the outside simple approach. And in this case, all you should know for going forward, there's this pattern of observable objects. And I don't need to go into detail on this because we had an excellent talk about RxJS just now. So yeah, you know an object changes and you can kind of track this or so, and that's doable by JavaScript itself. You can let the object observe what's now kind of replaced by proxy, or you use RxJS, whatever you like. That's all kind of helping you to understand what's going on there. And to break it down to kind of simple coding steps without kind of writing the code, I just want you to follow, understand, is that the first step when we write our script that should set up our application, how it should behave, is that we say, OK, we make our data observable. So we take our JSON string and say, you're a piece of observable information that everybody should know about. OK, that's cool. The next step would probably be, we scan the page for a model because we want to set up those bindings. We want to see where the data is maybe used, or kind of how can we set up certain interactions on the page itself. Then the next step would probably be scanning for the mustache tags to see, okay, where I need to kind of replace the content with the data I've created. And all you do, like, your JavaScript is, of course, so sophisticated that it sets up those bindings for you, creates kind of a knowledge base as, okay, like, if you ever do this or so, then replace this piece of here, and stores all the information for you. And then, like we did on our application here, we bind our click events. So that's nice, OK. And that's pretty much how you build your data-driven approach, like from the outside in. Everybody can follow, kind of? Makes kind of sense. It did for me, but yeah, cool. And of course, I'm not a good JavaScript engineer per se, so I would never be good enough to write this whole awesomely thing working on itself. So I started, OK, what can I use for this? And at this point, when I started to go into the data-interested approach, I pretty much stumbled over Vue.js. And that was the thing where I said, OK, I really like this. It has a very similar approach in doing this how I like to do things. What kind of brought me to Vue.js itself, at the point starting with it, I found it to be very elegant from how it does things. I also like that it's very simple. And then in the same case, because it's simple and everything, it's also easily extendable. And in this process, it has had a very low barrier of entry. That was very nice. And like, for my case, to give some of the background, like not everybody has the opportunity to start a fresh project all the time. Very often you work on existing projects, and you have a huge code base to maintain maybe. And we at CodeShip, for example, we had an application that was running and used by 50,000 users every day. So you can't just say, OK, like I won't do anything for the next 4 months and just develop my new system from scratch. That's undoable and will never work out as you want. So you need something to say, OK, how can I inject everything, replace bits and pieces here? And that was the point where it's like, Vue.js allowed me to replace bits and pieces by itself or so and create, like, based on a simple data structure, what I want to do. And the most important thing I want to emphasize here is, like, Vue.js is just simple JavaScript. Like, it's not really doing a lot of auto magic everywhere. And when you first maybe stumble over it, it feels like, OK, this is doing so much stuff. What I liked about it, it's like just really simple JavaScript using objects and functions wherever possible. And those are cool to work with, easy to write. Everybody knows this. So let's go back a little bit into some code here. How does a Vue application in this case look like to have the simple approach? We set out our point of entry. In this case, we reference an element. That's the app thing. And then actually what Vue did was pretty much have the same JSON or similar JSON structure that we built before in our kind of from top of our head approach, where we say, OK, we have data set up there, and we have some methods. And that's it. Like, this should work out of the box. What's cool. And all we need to adjust to get it working as it should be, like we have our super awesome greeting formula that's probably one of the best ever. We set it up to say, OK, we want to show it the name. And in this case, Vue does a similar approach, and we use v-model, for example. That's their syntax to say, OK, I want to bind a model here. And also, I want to bind the event, for example, and here say v-on and define it should be a click. But that could be anything. What's kind of the more sophisticated approach already than to our simple approach before? And actually, at this point, I think Vue is more awesome to code it. And let's do some live coding, right? Yeah, you should never do live coding. Yeah, that's what I was told. But yeah, we'll do it anyway. So let's see what we have here prepared. It's like in a cooking show or so. We have pieces prepared here. That's cool. So we have our super good application here already on screen. We'll say, like, in this case, it's just really a simple page or so, but we just care for the piece of information in between here, those comments. We'll say, OK, we have our application, should be defined here, and we use, is it good readable in the back as well? Yeah? OK, cool. So we see we have like all the fields, and we use an input field. And here we bound our V model, say to reference name, for example. And then we have a button that should look like an awesome button. And in the end or so, that's something where I didn't go into detail before, but it's something where you just need to trust me here, is this V4 thingy. That's just like how to iterate over something, like could be an object, could be an array, whatever you want to iterate over. If it's iteratable by JavaScript or so, then you can just print it with a V4 loop easily. And what we do here is we have, like, we print out for every member its name, for example. So we expect there's a JSON object having a member and a name, or having a name in it. And like here I prepared a little bit of information, like our Vue object so far. We have put some data in there already. So we have our members, like we saw on the front end, and everybody has a name, and it's our application generally is a party list. So the screen sizes are a little off here. Let's make this up. It's pretty hard to grab this. Yeah, and we have like data. Then of course, one thing you should always do is kind of reference the data that you want to use anywhere inside your data structure. Because, for example, the name, even if it's empty by default or so, just assign it, because otherwise you will maybe forget that it's there, or you do some auto-assigning at one point or so. Then you always say, OK, where does this value come from or so? Always assign whatever data you want to have up front in your data object or data structure. And already have prepared a small little function that's called add. And that's the one that should add everybody who's coming to our super awesome party to the list of party members that are invited. So what we do here. So we have our add function already. So that's cool. The big question here is how can we add those? So we're pretty sure that if we type something here, it's kind of bound to the data. But if I click on add to list or so, like nothing happens. Just the page refreshes because it's submitting the form, it's going nowhere. And that's not what we want. So there's a piece of information we learned before, and that's that we can bind something with a V on. And in this case, we bind it to submit. That's cool. And we have the function in our method. So all is what we do is, OK, on submit, call the add function. That's all you should do. That's also easy. Let's save the page. And it should have auto-refreshed. And if I add something here, like, OK, Tom is in the list. As you may have seen, he was there for just a second. But yeah, he's now gone or so. And that's like not cool how we want to maintain our application. Let's say we want to see somebody, it should be kind of persisted. Like if I refresh the page, now it will be gone, the data, of course. But I want to have stayed on the page, whatever do. And I think this is one thing everybody from us does automatically at this point, where say in jQuery or whatever, you bind the event, you always does event prevent default. That's kind of the classic you want to do. And here in this case, the easy way we want to do is what just we call .prevent on a submit function. Then we don't have to define it anywhere else. So that's nice. We refresh the page and say, now, Tom, please really come to our party. And he actually stays inside of our list. So that's already pretty nice. So we bound our first function that we have here to the DOM or so, and it kind of makes sense, at least for me. And the cool thing is, we still don't reference anything inside. It's all stored in our data store outside of the document itself. So the next thing is maybe, as you see here in the data, some people have arrived at the party, some have not, and I want to kind of keep track of those people that are there at the party. And yeah, I can click. I want to do this by clicking, and that's all fine, but nothing happens, of course. So what we do here is I've prepared a small class, and if we call it a class, I think I just called it yes by default. And if we apply yes, that's the thing that just puts a dash through our members. But of course, we want to make this dependent actually on the data that we have outside. So let's do the very simple approach here. There's something called vbind that allows you to bind certain behaviors based on functionality to interact with your DOM as well. And in this case, we want to bind to class. So For time constraints, I can't go into all detail explaining it. So some things you have to take for granted, but you can catch me later at any point. So in this case, our syntax would be, we have the yes function. And this one should be based on, for example, if our member dot arrived. So that should be the indicator telling us if a member is actually arrived at our party. And as we see, actually, Murphy, it's, by the way, the name of my dog, has arrived at the party. What's cool. And that's, in fact, true based on our data. So the next thing is we maybe want to toggle how those people behave or come to the party. And here also have the function, which just kind of toggles the arrived state of those people. We can use what we learned before. I'll just break it in an extra line here. Let's say v on click and say toggle member. And you probably have guessed it already that it would look something like this. And let's test if it really works. And we can click on Spike arrived, Murphy, and Ruby is also there. So that's awesome. And of course, as everything is data-driven, we can add Tom to the party, and he actually arrived as well. So that's all working, of course, out of the box, how you would expect it. Haven't come to finish? OK, cool. Yeah, there's one cool thing I want to show still quickly. I will be super fast coding, the best I ever did. Like, maybe you want to keep track of who arrived at the party and who is on the waiting list or we're waiting for. We want to have some numbers because we have invited 2,000 people, whatever. So there I want to show you a quick pattern that's inside Vue.js, and it's called computed properties. And computed properties, think about it, it's like data that evaluates based on your data out of the box and kind of caches those values for you. So we saw something, there's a method called arrived, or that's what we want to print out at least. Say, OK, we want to see who arrived at our party. And all we want to do is say, OK, we return this members, because we reference our data that we have. And then we want to filter through it and say, every member that is actually, m.arrived. And we want to have the length of those. So that looks kind of good. And yeah, that's why you should never do live coding, yeah? So looks good now, yeah? Oh, we see one member does. That looks good. And that's cool. And we did a similar thing for our people who are waiting. We will just copy. Oopsie. We will just copy here. We say waiting. And in this case, we want to have the people that not have arrived. And we have 2. And it kind of makes sense already because it's bound on the data. And as soon as we add somebody to the list or so, it will be, of course, another person waiting. And we can add them to the list. And now everybody's here at the party. And that's kind of super cool. So before coming to the end, I could fill like 2 hours of talking about Vue.js because I really like it. And there are components you could look into. They look something like this. I have to rush through, sorry. There are some really good dev tools you can use to inspect your data. It looks something like this, where you say, OK, this is how the components on my page shape up and so on, where the data is at. And you have state management. You use easy testing, because it's all function and components, and so much more. Just thank you.